The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles had witnessed many ceremonies of state, but none quite like this. On June 28, 1919, the Great Gallery, 233 feet long, lined with 17 arched windows and 17 corresponding mirrors, its ceiling, decorated with paintings celebrating the glory of Louis XIV, was packed with diplomats, generals, journalists, and dignitaries from around the world. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the gilded furnishings and the expectant faces of over 1,000 witnesses. Outside, crowds pressed against the palace gates, waiting for news that would reshape the world. At the center of it all, at a table covered in red velvet, sat two men who represented a nation that was not welcome at this gathering. Dr. Hermann Müller, the German foreign minister, and Dr. Johannes Bell, the minister of transport, had been chosen by their government to perform the most humiliating task any German official had ever been asked to perform: to sign the treaty that would officially end the Great War and acknowledge Germany's responsibility for causing it. The location had been chosen with deliberate cruelty. In this very room, on January 18, 1871, the Prussian King Wilhelm I had been proclaimed German Emperor, completing the unification of Germany after its victory over France. The French had never forgotten that humiliation, the German soldiers celebrating in the palace of the Sun King while Paris starved under siege. Now, 48 years later, the French would have their revenge. Germany would be humiliated in the same room where it had proclaimed its empire. The German delegates entered at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They walked past ranks of Allied officers, past the representatives of nations that had fought Germany for 4 years, past the wounded French soldiers who had been placed in prominent positions as living reminders of what Germany had done. The hatred in the room was palpable. No one spoke to the Germans. No one acknowledged their presence except to direct them to their places. The treaty document lay open on the table. It was 440 articles long, covering every aspect of Germany's defeat: territorial losses, military restrictions, reparations payments, colonial seizures, and the infamous Article 231, the war guilt clause that required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. The Germans had been given the treaty text in May, had submitted written objections, had received minor concessions on a few points, but had been denied any meaningful negotiation. This was not a peace conference. It was a sentencing. Georges Clemenceau, the French prime minister who had presided over the conference with iron determination, called the session to order. His voice was cold, devoid of triumph. "The session is open," he announced. The Allied and associated powers on the one side and the German Reich on the other have agreed to conclude a peace. The text has been completed, verified, and communicated to the German delegation. Bring in the Germans. The formality was a pretense. The Germans were already present. But Clemenceau would not acknowledge them until the moment required it. He would not give them a shred of dignity that could be withheld. Dr. Müller and Dr. Bell rose from their seats. They walked to the signing table, their faces pale, their hands visibly trembling. As they bent over the treaty, pens in hand, one of the German officials present, some accounts say it was Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, who had led the German delegation earlier in the conference, whispered to a colleague, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. The prediction would prove accurate almost to the day. Exactly 20 years and 68 days later, Germany would invade Poland, and the Second World War would begin. The Germans signed. The Allied representatives signed. The cannons at Versailles began to fire, announcing to France and to the world that the war was over. The crowds outside the palace cheered. In Paris, the celebrations began. In Berlin, the mood was black despair. The Treaty of Versailles was now international law. It would remain the most controversial peace settlement in modern history, praised by some as a reasonable attempt to prevent future German aggression, condemned by others as a vindictive catastrophe that guaranteed another war. Both assessments contain elements of truth. The treaty was neither wise nor foolish, neither just nor unjust, but a deeply flawed compromise that reflected the contradictions of the moment in which it was created. This is the story of how that treaty came to be, of how the peacemakers gathered in Paris with high hopes and clashing agendas, of how borders were drawn, nations were created, and empires were dismembered, of how the decisions made in 6 months of negotiations in 1919 would shape the politics of Europe for decades and ultimately lead to a war that would dwarf the one they were trying to end. This is the story of the peace to end all peace. The Paris Peace Conference opened on January 18, 1919, a date chosen for its symbolic significance. It was the anniversary of the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871. From the beginning, the conference was marked by ceremony, symbolism, and barely concealed revenge. The conference was the largest diplomatic gathering in history. Delegates from 32 nations assembled in Paris, representing the victorious Allied and associated powers. They came from Europe and Asia, from Africa and the Americas, from colonial territories and ancient civilizations. They brought with them experts on every conceivable subject. Historians, geographers, economists, ethnographers, military specialists, and legal scholars. Hotels were commandeered. Offices were requisitioned. An army of translators, secretaries, and support staff was assembled. Paris became the capital of the world, but for all its scale, the conference was dominated by a handful of men. The Big Four, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy made the crucial decisions. They met daily, sometimes for hours at a time, arguing, bargaining, compromising. The fate of millions depended on their ability to agree. Each brought to the conference a different vision of what peace should look like, shaped by their nations, experiences, and their own personalities. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe in December 1918 to a reception unlike anything an American president had ever experienced. Crowds in Paris, London, and Rome greeted him as a savior, a prophet of a new world order based on justice and democracy rather than imperial power politics. Wilson had articulated his vision in his 14 points, delivered in a speech to Congress in January 1918. He called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, colonial adjustments based on the interests of the populations concerned, and, most importantly, the establishment of a general association of nations that would guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of all states. Wilson believed that the old European system of alliances, empires, and secret treaties had caused the war. Replace it with a new system based on self-determination, democratic governance, and collective security, and war would become obsolete. The League of Nations, Wilson's great project, would be the mechanism for this transformation. It would provide a forum for resolving disputes peacefully, a framework for collective action against aggressors, and a guarantee that the sacrifices of the war would not have been in vain. Wilson's idealism was genuine but also naive. He understood little of European politics and less of European history. He had never traveled to Europe before becoming president. He viewed the conference as an opportunity to remake the world according to American principles, not recognizing that those principles often conflicted with each other and with the realities of European power. Self-determination sounded noble, but what happened when two peoples claimed the same territory? Democracy was admirable, but what happened when democratic majorities voted for policies that threatened their neighbors? Moreover, Wilson's political position was weaker than it appeared. In the November 1918 midterm elections, the Republican Party had won control of both houses of Congress. The Republicans were skeptical of the League of Nations and hostile to Wilson personally. Any treaty Wilson negotiated would have to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate, where Republicans now held the majority. Wilson needed Republican support, but seemed incapable of building it. Georges Clemenceau, at 77, the oldest of the Big Four, brought a very different perspective. He had been born during the reign of Louis Philippe and had lived through the Revolution of 1848, the Second Empire, the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, and the entire history of the Third Republic. He had been a young man when German armies besieged Paris in 1870, had witnessed the humiliation of France, and had devoted his political career to preparing for the next confrontation with Germany. Clemenceau was known as the Tiger for his ferocity in debate and his relentless attacks on political opponents. He had come to power in November 1917 at the darkest moment of the war for France, when the army was exhausted, morale was collapsing, and defeat seemed possible. Through sheer force of will, he had rallied France for one more effort, had purged defeatists from the government, had told the Chamber of Deputies that his policy was simple: war, nothing but war. Now that victory had been achieved, his policy was equally simple: security for France. Nothing else mattered. Clemenceau had no faith in Wilsonian idealism. The League of Nations might be a nice idea, but it would not stop German tanks. Self-determination was fine for people who had been oppressed by Germany, but it should not apply to Germans seeking to unite with Austria or to recover territory lost to France. What France needed was concrete guarantees: the return of Alsace-Lorraine, a demilitarized Rhineland, massive reparations, and a Germany so weakened that it could never again threaten its neighbors. "Wilson talks like Jesus Christ, but acts like Lloyd George," Clemenceau reportedly said. He had no patience for moralizing. France had lost 1.4 million soldiers killed and another 4 million wounded. Its northeastern provinces had been devastated by 4 years of fighting. The next war with Germany, and Clemenceau was certain there would be one, might well destroy France entirely. The peace settlement had to prevent that, by force if necessary. David Lloyd George was the most politically nimble of the Big Four, but also the most conflicted. Britain had achieved its primary war aims. The German High Seas Fleet had surrendered, Germany's colonies had been seized, and German commercial competition had been eliminated. Britain did not need to crush Germany. Indeed, a stable Germany might be useful as a counterweight to France and as a barrier against Bolshevism. But Lloyd George was a Democratic politician who had just won an election in which British voters had demanded harsh treatment of Germany. "Hang the Kaiser," had been the cry. "Squeeze Germany until the pips squeak." Lloyd George could not ignore public opinion, even when he privately doubted its wisdom. He had to appear tough on Germany while quietly working to moderate the most extreme demand. Lloyd George also faced the challenge of managing the British Empire's interests. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, had contributed enormously to the war effort and expected to be heard at the peace conference. India, too, had sent over 1 million soldiers to fight for the empire and was becoming increasingly restive under British rule. The colonial territories seized from Germany had to be distributed. The Middle Eastern territories of the Ottoman Empire, promised to multiple parties through overlapping and contradictory agreements, had to be sorted out. Vittorio Orlando of Italy was the weakest of the Big Four and would eventually walk out of the conference in protest. Italy had entered the war in 1915 after secret negotiations with Britain and France, which had promised Italy substantial territorial gains: the Trentino, the South Tyrol, Trieste, Istria, and large portions of the Dalmatian coast. These promises had been made in the Treaty of London, signed before Wilson and his 14 points entered the picture. Now the Italians wanted to collect on those promises. But Wilson opposed giving Italy territories populated largely by Germans and Slavs. The principle of self-determination, he insisted, applied to everyone, not just to peoples whose claims served Allied interests. The clash between Italian demands and Wilsonian principles would poison the conference and contribute to Italy's post-war instability. The first months of the conference were consumed by procedural wrangling, competing claims, and the sheer complexity of the issues at hand. The defeated powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, were excluded from the negotiations. They would be presented with terms and given the choice to accept or reject, but they would not participate in drafting those terms. This departure from traditional diplomatic practice was deliberate. The war, the Allies believed, had been caused by German aggression. Germany was a criminal that would be sentenced, not a party that would negotiate. The question of what to do with Germany dominated the conference. France wanted the Rhineland, the German territory west of the Rhine, to be permanently separated from Germany and placed under French protection. This would give France a buffer zone against future German attack and would deprive Germany of one of its most industrialized regions. Clemenceau also wanted the Saar Basin, with its rich coal mines, to be transferred to France as compensation for the destruction of French mines during the war. Wilson and Lloyd George opposed the permanent separation of the Rhineland from Germany. Such a step would violate self-determination. The Rhinelanders were German and wanted to remain German, and would create exactly the kind of grievance that might lead to future conflict. After weeks of argument, a compromise was reached. The Rhineland would remain part of Germany, but would be demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. The Saar would be administered by the League of Nations for 15 years, with a plebiscite to determine its future. In the meantime, France would control the coal mines. The French also demanded massive reparations. The war had destroyed large portions of northeastern France. Factories had been demolished, mines flooded, and farmland made unusable by shell craters and unexploded ordnance. Someone had to pay for this destruction, and the French believed it should be Germany. But how much should Germany pay? The question was fiendishly complicated. The damage was real but difficult to quantify. The costs of reconstruction were estimated, subject to dispute. The capacity of Germany to pay was uncertain. If reparations were set too high, Germany might refuse to pay or might be unable to pay, leading to continued conflict. If set too low, France would not receive the compensation it needed to rebuild. The conference never fully resolved this question. The treaty established that Germany would pay reparations, but left the total amount to be determined later by a reparations commission. This postponed the conflict, but did not resolve it. The figure eventually set, 132 billion gold marks, would prove impossible to collect and would contribute to the economic chaos of the 1920s. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the treaty, was drafted as a legal foundation for reparations. It stated that Germany and its allies were responsible for all the loss and damage suffered by the Allies as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. The clause was intended primarily as a legal justification for demanding compensation, not as a moral judgment on German character. But Germans interpreted it as a declaration that Germany was uniquely evil, solely responsible for a war that many believed had been caused by the mistakes of all the great powers. The territorial provisions of the treaty stripped Germany of significant territory. Alsace-Lorraine, seized by Germany in 1871, was returned to France. The provinces of Posen and West Prussia, with their predominantly Polish populations, were given to the newly recreated Poland. This created the Polish Corridor, a strip of territory that gave Poland access to the sea but separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The port of Danzig, at the end of the corridor, became a free city under League of Nations protection, neither Polish nor German. In the east, plebiscites would determine the fate of Upper Silesia, a region claimed by both Germany and Poland. The referendum, held in 1921, would produce a confused result, a German majority overall, but Polish majorities in certain areas, leading to a partition that satisfied neither side. Small territories were transferred to Belgium and Denmark. North Schleswig would vote to join Denmark, while South Schleswig would remain part of Germany. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies. The African territories, German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland, Cameroon, were distributed among Britain, France, Belgium, and South Africa as mandates under League of Nations supervision. Germany's Pacific possessions went to Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Germany's concessions in China were transferred to Japan, a decision that would outrage Chinese nationalists and contribute to the May 4th movement. The military provisions were designed to prevent Germany from ever again threatening its neighbors. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, too small to threaten any major power. Conscription was abolished. The army would be a professional force with long-term enlistments. The general staff was dissolved. Military schools were closed. The Navy was restricted to a handful of small warships. Submarines were banned entirely. The Air Force was abolished. Germany was forbidden to have military aircraft. Tanks and heavy artillery were prohibited. The Rhineland was demilitarized permanently. No German forces could ever be stationed there. These restrictions were comprehensive, but they were also difficult to enforce. The treaty created a system of inspections, but inspectors could not be everywhere. Germany immediately began evading the restrictions through secret arrangements with the Soviet Union, which was itself an outcast from the international system. German military officers trained in Russia, German aircraft designers worked in other countries. The foundations of rearmament were laid even as the ink on the treaty dried. While the German treaty consumed most of the conference's attention, the peacemakers also had to deal with the collapse of 3 other empires and the creation of new nations across Central and Eastern Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had disintegrated in the final weeks of the war, as its component nationalities declared independence one after another. The peace conference had to sort out the resulting chaos, drawing borders between states whose populations were hopelessly intermingled and whose claims often contradicted each other. Austria itself was reduced to a small landlocked republic of approximately 7 million people. The German-speaking Alpine regions that remained were economically marginal without access to the resources and markets of the former empire. Many Austrians believed that their small state could not survive independently and wanted to unite with Germany, the ancillus that would be prohibited by the treaty. Article 80 of the Treaty of Versailles forbade a German-Austrian union without League of Nations approval, an approval that would never be given. The Sudetenland, the mountainous border regions of Bohemia and Moravia that had been part of the Austrian Empire and were populated largely by ethnic Germans, was assigned to the new Czechoslovakia. This decision was based on strategic and economic logic. The Sudeten Mountains were Czechoslovakia's natural defensive frontier, and the region contained important industries, but it violated the principle of self-determination. 3 million Germans who wanted to join Germany or Austria were instead made citizens of a Slavic state. Hitler would exploit this grievance in 1938. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, signed with Austria in September 1919, formalized these arrangements. Austria was prohibited from uniting with Germany, was required to pay reparations, though it had no means to do so, and was stripped of its access to the sea. The port of Trieste, Austria's outlet to the Mediterranean, went to Italy. Hungary suffered even more severely under the Treaty of Trianon, signed in June 1920. The treaty stripped Hungary of 2/3 of its pre-war territory and 3/5 of its population. Transylvania, with its mixed Romanian, Hungarian, and German population, went to Romania. Slovakia went to Czechoslovakia. Croatia and Slovenia went to the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later renamed Yugoslavia. The Banat was divided between Romania and Yugoslavia. Even small strips of territory went to Austria and Poland. Over 3 million ethnic Hungarians found themselves living as minorities in neighboring states. Hungarian resentment at the Treaty of Trianon would persist for decades. Nem soha, no, never, became the rallying cry of Hungarian revisionism. Hungary would become a willing ally of any power that promised to restore its lost territories, and in the 1930s, that power would be Nazi Germany. Poland, resurrected after 123 years of partition, faced the challenge of defining its borders. The western border with Germany was established by the Peace Conference, creating the Polish Corridor and the Free City of Danzig. But Poland's eastern border remained undefined. Polish nationalists dreamed of restoring the historic borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This brought Poland into conflict with the new Soviet state, resulting in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1921. The war ended with a Polish victory and the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which established a border well to the east of the ethnic Polish population. Poland now includes large Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities whose loyalty was uncertain. The border satisfied neither side and would be a source of conflict until it was erased by the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. Czechoslovakia was perhaps the most successful of the new states created at Paris. It had a democratic constitution, a strong industrial base inherited from the Austrian Empire, and capable leadership under President Tomáš Masaryk and Foreign Minister Edvard Beneš. But it also contained substantial minorities: Germans in the Sudetenland, Hungarians in Slovakia, Poles in Teschen, Ruthenians in the east. The state that the peacemakers had created was viable only as long as its neighbors were. When Germany revived, Czechoslovakia's existence would be threatened. Yugoslavia, officially the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes until 1929, was a more problematic creation. It combined people with different histories, religions, and alphabets. Orthodox Serbs who had been independent for a century, Catholic Croats and Slovenes who had lived under Austro-Hungarian rule, Bosnian Muslims, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and various smaller groups. The Serbs dominated the new state, which was essentially Greater Serbia under a different name. Croatian and other nationalisms would fester, eventually tearing the country apart in the 1990s. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, emerged from the chaos of Russian collapse and German defeat. They fought wars against Bolshevik Russia, against each other, and against German Freikorps units that hoped to carve out territories of their own. Eventually, all three achieved independence, though their borders remained disputed and their existence depended on the continued weakness of their larger neighbors. Finland, which had declared independence from Russia in 1917, fought a brutal civil war between Reds and Whites that ended with White victory in 1918. Finnish independence was recognized by the Peace Conference, but Finland's eastern border with Russia would remain a source of conflict, leading to the Winter War of 1939-1940. The treatment of the Ottoman Empire and the disposition of its territories created problems that would outlast all others. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war as a German ally and had fought on multiple fronts: against Russia in the Caucasus, against Britain in Mesopotamia and Palestine, against the Anzacs at Gallipoli. The empire had suffered enormous losses, including the Armenian Genocide of 1915, in which an estimated 1.5 million Armenians were killed or died during forced deportations. By 1918, the empire was collapsing. British forces occupied Mesopotamia and Palestine. Arab forces, encouraged by British promises of independence, had revolted against Ottoman rule. The armistice of Mudros in October 1918 ended Ottoman participation in the war, but the future of the empire's territories remained uncertain. The problem was that Britain and France had made multiple contradictory promises about the post-war disposition of Ottoman lands. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, negotiated in secret between Britain and France, had divided the Arab territories into spheres of influence. France would control Syria and Lebanon, Britain would control Mesopotamia, Iraq, and the area around Haifa. Palestine would be under international administration. The Arabian Peninsula would be an independent Arab state or states. But Britain had also made promises to the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, promising Arab independence in exchange for the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. The precise boundaries of the promised Arab state were never clearly defined, and the correspondence between Hussein and the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, was ambiguous about whether Palestine was included. And then there was the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. In which the British government declared its support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration promised that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, a qualification that would prove impossible to fulfill. These three sets of promises, to the French, to the Arabs, and to the Zionists, were fundamentally incompatible. The Peace Conference had to sort them out. The solution was the mandate system. The former Ottoman territories would not become colonies of the victorious powers that would violate Wilsonian principles, but would instead be administered as mandates under League of Nations supervision. The mandatory powers would prepare the territories for eventual independence while governing them in the meantime. In practice, this was colonialism under a different name. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received the mandates for Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. The mandatory powers drew borders, appointed governments, suppressed rebellions, and governed according to their own interests while paying lip service to the principle of eventual self-determination. The borders drawn in Paris and subsequent agreements created the modern Middle East. Iraq was cobbled together from 3 Ottoman provinces with very different populations. Kurds in the north around Mosul, Sunni Arabs in the center around Baghdad, and Shia Arabs in the south around Basra. These populations had little in common except Ottoman administration, and they would struggle to form a coherent nation. Syria was divided from Lebanon along sectarian lines, with France carving out a Christian-majority state, Lebanon, from what Syrian nationalists considered Syrian territory. Syrian territory. The border between Syria and Iraq was drawn with a ruler, a straight line through the desert that bore no relationship to topography, population, or history. The Palestine Mandate was the most problematic of all. Britain was now responsible for implementing the Balfour Declaration while also protecting the rights of the Arab majority. Jewish immigration to Palestine was permitted, angering the Arab population. Arab protests were suppressed, angering Arab nationalists throughout the region. The foundations of a conflict that continues to this day were laid in the decisions of 1919-1920. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed with the Ottoman Empire in August 1920, went further than any of the other peace treaties. It not only stripped the empire of its Arab territories, but also partitioned Anatolia itself. Greece would receive Thrace and the area around Smyrna on the Aegean coast. Italy would receive a sphere of influence in southwestern Anatolia. France would receive a sphere in the southeast. An independent Armenian state would be created in the northeast. The Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles would be internationalized. Kurdistan might become independent. The Ottoman Sultan would retain only a rump state around Constantinople. The Treaty of Sèvres was too harsh to be enforced. Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, rejected the treaty and organized resistance. Greek forces, which had occupied Smyrna in 1919, advanced into Anatolia, leading to a full-scale war. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922 ended with a decisive Turkish victory. Greek forces were driven from Anatolia, and over 1 million Greek civilians fled or were expelled. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 replaced Sèvres, recognizing a Turkish state roughly equivalent to modern Turkey. The Lausanne Treaty was the only major post-World War I settlement that was truly negotiated, rather than imposed. It also included provisions for population exchanges between Greece and Turkey. Approximately 1.5 million Greeks left Turkey, and 500,000 Turks left Greece. This ethnic cleansing was brutal but effective, eliminating the minority populations that might have been sources of future conflict. It was a grim precedent for the far larger population transfers that would follow World War II. Beyond the treaties with the defeated powers, the Peace Conference also addressed colonial and territorial questions around the world, often with consequences that the peacemakers did not anticipate. Japan, as one of the victorious Allied powers, expected to be treated as an equal. It had seized German possessions in China and the Pacific and wanted to retain them. It also wanted the Peace Conference to endorse a declaration of racial equality, affirming that all races were equal and should be treated as such. The Racial Equality Clause was proposed as an amendment to the League of Nations Covenant. It was supported by a majority of the nations present, but Wilson, chairing the session, ruled that the vote was not unanimous and therefore the amendment failed. Wilson's decision reflected American domestic politics. Any suggestion of racial equality would have been anathema to the segregationist South, but it was a profound insult to Japan. The Japanese delegation felt betrayed by the West's refusal to acknowledge racial equality, a grievance that would contribute to Japan's eventual break with the Western powers. Japan did receive German rights in Shandong province in China, including the port of Qingdao and railway concessions. This decision outraged Chinese nationalists, who had expected that German possessions in China would be returned to China. The Chinese delegation refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and the announcement of the Shandong decision triggered the May 4th movement in China. Massive protests that marked the beginning of modern Chinese nationalism and eventually contributed to the Chinese Communist Revolution. The conference also received petitions from people around the world who hoped that the principle of self-determination would apply to them. Egyptian nationalists petitioned for independence from Britain. Indian nationalists hoped that their contribution to the war effort would be rewarded with greater autonomy. Vietnamese nationalists, including a young man who would later become famous as Ho Chi Minh, petitioned for greater rights for the Vietnamese people under French colonial rule. Ho Chi Minh was living in Paris as a photograph retoucher and had become involved in Vietnamese expatriate politics. He drafted a petition to the peace conference requesting that the Vietnamese be granted equal rights with the French in Indochina, et independence, merely equality. The petition was ignored. Ho's disillusionment with Western promises of self-determination would lead him to communism and eventually to the wars that would consume Vietnam for decades. The African-American leader W.E.B. Du Bois organized a Pan-African Congress in Paris in 1919, calling attention to the situation of Africans under colonial rule and demanding greater rights. The Congress had little immediate impact, but it was an early step in the Pan-African movement that would eventually lead to decolonization. Across the colonial world, the lesson of the peace conference was clear. Self-determination was for Europeans, not for the peoples of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The conference had spoken of universal principles, but had applied them selectively. The gap between rhetoric and reality would fuel nationalist movements throughout the colonial world. The League of Nations was Wilson's greatest hope and his greatest achievement at the peace conference. He believed that the League would be the mechanism for correcting the inevitable imperfections of the peace settlement. If borders were drawn wrongly, the League would adjust them. If conflicts arose, the League would resolve them. If aggressors threatened the peace, the League would mobilize collective resistance. The League Covenant was incorporated into each of the peace treaties, making membership in the League a condition of accepting the peace settlement. The Covenant established the League's structure, an assembly where all member nations would meet, a council where the great powers would address urgent matters, and a permanent secretariat to handle administrative functions. The League would also oversee the mandate system and various humanitarian and technical organizations. The most important provision of the Covenant was Article 10, which committed members to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. This was the collective security provision that Wilson believed would prevent future wars. An attack on one member would be an attack on all. Aggressors would face the combined opposition of the entire international community. But the League had fundamental weaknesses that would prevent it from fulfilling Wilson's hopes. First, the League had no independent military force. It could recommend that members take action against aggressors, but it could not compel them to do so. Each member retained sovereignty over its own military forces. If members were unwilling to fight, the League was powerless. Second, decisions required unanimity. Any member could veto any action. This meant that the League could act only when all members agreed, which in practice meant that it could act only against weak and isolated states, not against major powers. Third, the League excluded the defeated powers and the Soviet Union. Germany was not admitted until 1926. The Soviet Union was not admitted until 1934. This meant that two of Europe's most powerful nations were outside the system for most of the interwar period. Fourth, and most fatally, the United States never joined. Wilson returned to the United States in July 1919, confident that the Senate would ratify the treaty and the League Covenant. He was wrong. Republican senators led by Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts opposed the League on both substantive and political grounds. They objected to Article 10, which they believed would commit the United States to fight in foreign wars without congressional approval. They objected to the loss of sovereignty implied by League membership, and they objected to giving Wilson a political victory. Wilson refused to compromise. He believed that the League was too important to be weakened by reservations and amendments. Rather than negotiate with Lodge and the Republicans, he decided to take his case directly to the American people. In September 1919, Wilson embarked on a national speaking tour to rally public support for the League. He traveled over 8,000 miles, delivering dozens of speeches. But the strain was too much. On September 25, Wilson collapsed in Pueblo, Colorado. He was rushed back to Washington, where he suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and incapacitated. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, Wilson was essentially an invalid hidden from public view, his wife Edith acting as gatekeeper to the president. He refused to accept any reservations to the treaty. When the Senate voted on the treaty with reservations in November 1919, Wilson ordered Democratic senators to vote against it. When the Senate voted again in March 1920, the result was the same. The treaty failed to receive the two-thirds majority required for ratification. The United States never joined the League of Nations. The organization that Wilson had created to prevent future wars would have to function without the world's most powerful nation. The League would have some successes. It resolved minor disputes, it administered mandates, it did useful humanitarian work. But when confronted with determined aggression by major powers, it would prove helpless. The American rejection of the League was a catastrophe for the international order. Without American participation, Britain and France were the League's most powerful members, but neither was willing to commit its forces to uphold collective security unless its own vital interests were directly threatened. The League could condemn aggression, could impose sanctions, could issue reports, but it could not prevent determined aggressors from achieving their goals. The consequences would become clear in the 1930s, when Japan invaded Manchuria, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. In each case, the League condemned the aggression but took no effective action to reverse it. By 1939, the League was a hollow shell, its promises of collective security exposed as illusions. Even as the treaties were being signed, critics were pointing out their flaws. The most famous critique came from John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who had served as a Treasury representative at the conference. Keynes resigned in disgust in June 1919, convinced that the treaty's economic provisions would destroy the European economy and guarantee future conflict. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in December 1919, Keynes argued that the reparations demanded of Germany were impossibly high, that Germany lacked the capacity to pay them, and that the attempt to extract payment would destroy Germany's economy and, by extension, the economy of Europe. Keynes also offered devastating portraits of the Big Three, depicting Wilson as a blind and deaf Don Quixote, Clemenceau as a cynical power politician with one illusion, France, and Lloyd George as a manipulative opportunist who had no scruple. Keynes's book was a sensation. It shaped public opinion in Britain and America, creating a sense of guilt about the treaty's harshness that would influence policy for years. When Hitler demanded revision of the treaty in the 1930s, many in Britain and France felt that he had legitimate grievances. Keynes's critique, intended to promote economic rationality, inadvertently provided intellectual cover for appeasement. Keynes's analysis was influential but also contested. Later scholars have argued that his figures were exaggerated, that Germany had the capacity to pay if it had the will, and that the real problem was not the treaty but Germany's refusal to accept its terms. The debate continues to this day. Other critics focused on different aspects of the settlement. Some argued that the treaty was too harsh, creating grievances that would lead to future conflict. Others argued that it was not harsh enough, that it left Germany intact and capable of reviving. Still others focused on specific provisions, the Polish corridor, the Sudetenland, the war guilt clause, that they believed were unjust or unworkable. The fundamental problem with the Treaty of Versailles was not that it was too harsh or too lenient, but that it was inconsistent. It was harsh enough to generate lasting resentment, but not harsh enough to permanently weaken Germany. It created grievances without eliminating the capacity for revenge. It imposed burdens without providing the means of enforcement. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and that contained the seeds of its own destruction. Jan Smuts, the South African delegate who had played a major role in drafting the League Covenant, expressed his reservations in a famous statement: "There is no peace. There is no treaty of peace. There is only a kind of armistice, and a bad armistice at that. We are heading straight for disaster." Smuts signed the treaty anyway, believing that the League of Nations offered the possibility of correcting the settlement's flaws. He was wrong. The League could not correct what the treaty had created. The grievances were too deep, the resentments too bitter, the mechanisms of revision too weak. The treaties of 1919-1920, Versailles with Germany, Saint-Germain with Austria, Neuilly with Bulgaria, Trianon with Hungary, Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire, collectively reshaped the world. They created new nations and destroyed old empires. They drew borders that would define conflicts for the next century. They established institutions and principles that would guide, and fail to guide, international relations in the years to come. The peacemakers of Paris faced an impossible task. They had to satisfy public opinion in their home countries, which demanded harsh treatment of the defeated powers. They had to address the legitimate security concerns of France and the other nations that had been attacked. They had to apply the principle of self-determination to regions where populations were hopelessly intermingled. They had to create a new international order while managing the chaos of revolution, famine, and disease that was sweeping across Europe. Given these constraints, perhaps no peace settlement could have been entirely satisfactory. But the settlement they created was worse than unsatisfactory. It was unstable. The instability was evident almost immediately. Germany refused to accept the treaty as legitimate. The German government signed under protest, calling the treaty a dictated peace, diktat, imposed by victors who had promised a peace based on Wilson's 14 points but had delivered something quite different. German nationalists vowed to overturn the treaty at the first opportunity. The November criminals who had signed the armistice and the treaty became targets of hatred. The stab-in-the-back myth fused with resentment of Versailles to create a toxic political culture that Adolf Hitler would exploit. He refused to accept Trianon. Nem, so became the rallying cry of a nation that would never reconcile itself to the loss of 2/3 of its territory. Hungarian revisionism would make Hungary a natural ally for any power that promised to overturn the post-war settlement. Italy felt cheated. It had not received all the territories promised in the Treaty of London. The phrase mutilated victory, vittoria mutilata, captured Italian resentment. Italian nationalists, including Benito Mussolini, would build political movements on the promise of claiming what Italy had been denied. Japan felt insulted. The rejection of the racial equality clause, combined with later restrictions on Japanese immigration to the United States, convinced many Japanese that the Western powers would never accept Japan as an equal. Japanese expansionists argued that Japan should build its own empire in Asia rather than seeking acceptance from the West. The successor states of Central and Eastern Europe were fragile creations, dependent on the continued weakness of Germany and Russia. When those powers revived, the new states would be caught between them. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, all would be threatened when Germany and the Soviet Union grew strong again. The Middle East was a powder keg. The borders drawn in Paris had little relationship to ethnic, religious, or historical realities. The mandate system was colonialism by another name, and the peoples of the region knew it. The contradictory promises regarding Palestine guaranteed conflict between Jews and Arabs. The seeds of a century of violence had been planted. And the League of Nations, the institution that was supposed to prevent future wars, was crippled from birth. Without the United States, it lacked the power to enforce its decisions. Without the defeated powers, it lacked legitimacy. Without mechanisms for revision, it could not adapt to changing circumstances. It was a hope, not a reality. As the delegates departed Paris and the treaties entered into force, the world they had created began its descent toward catastrophe. The violence of the immediate post-war period continued. The Russian Civil War raged until 1922, claiming millions of lives. The Polish-Soviet War ended with Polish victory, but left lasting bitterness. The Greco-Turkish War ended with ethnic cleansing on a massive scale. Smaller conflicts erupted across Europe. In the Baltic, in Silesia, in the Balkans, wherever the post-war settlement was contested, economic chaos compounded the political instability. So, Germany, burdened by reparations and struggling with the transition from war to peace, experienced hyperinflation in 1923 that destroyed the savings of the middle class and discredited the Weimar Republic. The wider European economy, disrupted by the war and the dismemberment of empires, struggled to recover. The international financial system, based on the gold standard, proved unstable. Unemployment remained high. Agricultural prices collapsed. Into this chaos stepped new political movements that promised to sweep away the failures of the old order. Fascism emerged in Italy, offering nationalism, militarism, and the promise of national renewal. Benito Mussolini took power in 1922, the first of the post-war dictators. His example would be followed by others, by authoritarians in Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, and eventually by Adolf Hitler in Germany. The peace of 1919 was not a peace at all. It was an interval between wars, a pause in a conflict that had not been resolved but only interrupted. The decisions made in Paris, the borders drawn, the grievances created, the institutions established, the hopes raised and dashed, would all contribute to the catastrophe that followed. 20 years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, German tanks would roll across the Polish frontier and the Second World War would begin. The prediction whispered at the signing ceremony, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years," would prove tragically accurate. The peace to end all peace had created the conditions for the greatest war in human history. In the years that followed, those who had participated in the peace conference would reflect on what they had done and what they had failed to do. Woodrow Wilson returned to the United States a broken man. His stroke in September 1919 left him incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. He died in 1924, his dream of American participation in the League of Nations unfulfilled. His idealism, so inspiring in 1918, had been ground down by the realities of power politics. His 14 points had been compromised, diluted, or ignored. The peace he had hoped for had not been achieved. Georges Clemenceau was voted out of office in 1920, having achieved his goal of weakening Germany. But having failed to secure the permanent guarantees he believed France needed. He lived until 1929, long enough to see the beginnings of the instability that would lead to another war. When asked what he thought the future held, he reportedly said, "I don't know what they'll do, but I know they'll do something wrong." David Lloyd George remained in power until 1922 and continued in politics for decades afterward. He came to believe that the treaty had been too harsh and that Germany should be conciliated. In the 1930s, he visited Hitler and came away impressed. His misjudgment of the Nazi leader was shared by many who had made the peace of 1919. Vittorio Orlando walked out of the peace conference in April 1919 after failing to secure Italy's territorial demands. He returned to sign the treaty but was voted out of office shortly afterward. His failure contributed to the sense of mutilated victory that Mussolini would exploit. John Maynard Keynes became one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. His critique of the treaty shaped opinion for decades. But his predictions of immediate economic collapse proved exaggerated, and his indirect contribution to appeasement remains controversial. And in Munich, a 30-year-old veteran named Adolf Hitler was just beginning his political career. He had found in the Treaty of Versailles everything he needed: a grievance, a scapegoat, and a mission. The November criminals who had signed the armistice and the treaty would be punished. The injustices of Versailles would be reversed. Germany would rise again, and those who had humiliated it would pay. Hitler's political manifesto, Mein Kampf, published in 1925, made his intentions clear. He would unite all Germans in a greater German Reich. He would tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He would acquire Lebensraum, living space in the East. He would deal with the Jews who he claimed had stabbed Germany in the back. The peace of 1919 had given him his program. All he needed was the opportunity to implement it. That opportunity would come. The instability created by the peace settlement, the economic chaos of the interwar period, the weakness of the League of Nations, and the divisions among the victorious powers all would contribute to Hitler's rise. The peace to end all peace would lead to a war that would kill 60 million people and reshape the world. Next time, we will examine the aftermath of the peace settlement and the chaos of the early 1920s. We will see how Europe struggled to recover from war, how new ideologies competed for power, how economic instability undermined democracy, and how the foundations of the fascist movements that would lead to the Second World War were laid. We will witness the birth of a new world, unstable, violent, and haunted by the ghosts of the war that was supposed to end all wars. The peace had been signed. The war was officially over. But the conflict continued by other means, through politics, through economics, through ideology, through the memories and resentments that would not fade. The road from Versailles to the Second World War had begun. The peace to end all peace had created a world at war.